On behalf of the director, Susan Weber, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight for the third and final of this year's Leon Levy Foundation Lectures in Jewish Material Culture. The title of the overall series has been Materiality and Politics: How Integrated Were Diaspora Jews in the Roman Empire. And tonight's talk bears the title Materiality and Culture: Did the Asian Jews Attain Stability in the High and Later Roman Empire from 200 to 600 CE. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge that the Bard Graduate Center on the island of Manhattan, once Mannahatta, lives out its life on the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people, Lenape-Hoking, as it was known, and that New York has been and remains a city of indigenous people and those who have come here willingly and also against their will. And I would say, perhaps thinking about the fact that this is not only the last of our public research events of the year, but also the last in this cycle of 5 years and 15 lectures in Jewish material culture, that one of the reasons why we can understand the deeper past of indigenous time is because of the contribution of the study of the ancient world to our understanding of temporality. And the advantage, the thing we learn from the study of the ancient world, we learn many things. We learn about what is familiar and continuous in human history and the human experience, and also so many of the things that change over time. But above all, it gives us an understanding that though we live now, whenever it is that we live, we also have the capacity of thinking past and thinking future. And our guide, more specifically to thinking past, Seth Schwartz, just for those who have not been at the first lecture, Seth is the Lucius Littauer Professor of Classical Jewish Civilization at Columbia University. Previously, he taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and he has been a fellow of many institutes for advanced study around the world. We've talked about the books that he has written. Just to give you a sense of what is forthcoming and not yet out, just a couple of titles that provide a little context for what we're doing here tonight and have been this semester. The Mishnah and the Limits of Roman Power, in a volume on Roman power and the Jews, and another title, Globalization or Culture: The Ancient Jews and the Mediterranean, forthcoming in a volume on Jews and the Mediterranean. And just 2 final notes before I turn the screen and the podium over to Seth. The first is to acknowledge how important for this project has been the support of the Leon Levy Foundation. I want especially to thank Shelby White for her support for this project from its inception, and also to thank the David Berg Foundation and its director, Michelle Tachi, for her support for this project. And to say that our interest in creating a context for the use of material culture as a way of shining a raking light on aspects of the Jewish past and near past that have not been so much attended to is in some sense borne out by where we are tonight, with a noted historian of the ancient world talking about politics and the place of the Jews in the ancient world, and using material culture, sensitive to the difficulties of using material culture as a way of asking those searching questions. So thank you very much, Seth, and thanks to the 4 lecturers, professors here at the Bard Graduate Center who have preceded him in this series. And now, Seth, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Say that both of those papers have actually appeared, the ones that you mentioned. Please rush out and buy the books in which they're published. One thing that you'll notice is that the actual title of the talk is a little bit different from the official title, which was basically, the best that I could think of around about November when we were planning. So whenever it was when we were planning for these talks. So things since then have become a little bit more refined. I'm not going to cover the period from 200 to 600 tonight, but what I think was going to do in those days, I was going to split up the High Roman Empire into 2 bits, which might have made a certain amount of sense with respect to comprehensibility. But I've actually decided that I'm going to try to be a little bit more ambitious about things, and I should say that in what I hope I hope that the written version of these lectures, which will be for publication, will actually continue the story down to the Persian invasion of Asia in 615 CE. And I also would like to have a few chapters on Egypt, which will serve as a comparison for Asia Minor. The material that I'm talking about tonight, and that is what I'm calling here the long 4th century from 250 to 410, is still, for me, a little bit inchoate, and the talk is to some extent problematic. This, once again, not to harp on the same old tired excuse, but it's for real. I was stymied a little bit by the conditions that we've all endured over the last year and change. But I think that I've made enough progress, both up until that point and since then, to be able to address, at least to begin to work out some thoughts about this period. The first thing that I would like to do is I would like to urge us to think of this time period as a meaningful period. So unfortunately, the talk begins with an exercise in periodization, which everyone always welcomes, but it's important. We have to do this. So let me just move ahead to a convenient timeline here of a few events that took place during this period. Now, I'm talking locally for our own purposes about Jews in the Roman Empire outside Palestine, more narrowly in Asia, but I think there may be some justification for thinking of this chunk of time, 250 to 410, as a meaningful period in broader terms also. Now, it does not coincide precisely with the first, presumably more tolerant century of Christian rule. Now, with the emperor, as people know, in the year 312, the Emperor Constantine is said to have converted to Christianity, and a short time after that, he issued the Edict of Milan, which declared an end to the persecution of Christianity, actually reaffirming an earlier decree by the non-Christian Emperor Galerius from 311, and that was a softer and conditional end to the persecution, but it also declared toleration of all religions. Constantine didn't rule in the East, which includes Asia and Egypt and Palestine, until 323. Starting in 325, he spent much effort and expense trying to get bishops to agree on a set of guidelines for an acceptable theology. In other words, he wanted the bishops under his rule to define a Christian orthodoxy. This was at the Council of Nicaea. This process eventually modified the toleration promoted in the Edict of Milan. Christian heretics, as more or less defined it, what actually happened at Nicaea is a little bit uncertain and controversial, but as would eventually become understood as the results of the Council of Nicaea, Christian heretics defined by this sort of consensus reached in Nicaea and in the years following were henceforth to be excluded from the general toleration. Jews and pagans, and pardon my use of the term pagans, there are some people who object to it, but it's the shortest way of saying what needs to be said. Jews and pagans were and long remained on much firmer legal ground than newly defined heretical Christians. As the 4th century progressed, ever more severe limitations were imposed on pagan ritual, but not on pagan identity, which remained legal to profess into the 7th century. You could still say you were a pagan in the year 600. By contrast, legal constraints were imposed on Jews, mainly starting in the early 5th century and following, but not really so much in the 4th century. It's a complicated issue, which I discussed previously. I'm not going to get into here. Christianization was a gradual process which gained momentum in the 390s, probably because of a growing realization that in many places, Christians were becoming numerically dominant. By the 410s or 420s, but not much before that, people living in the Roman Empire probably began to have the strong sense of living in a Christian state. They also may, especially but not exclusively in the West, have had the sense of living in a declining state or a failing state, since in 410, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths, though there was in fact less to this than meets the eye, given that the Visigothic ruler Alaric and his men had become over the decades so thoroughly part of the Roman military and political establishments that his attack on Rome was in effect a battle and a civil war, not an invasion by the horn-helmeted barbarians of the popular imagination. Also, Rome was no longer the capital of the Western Empire. The justification for the opening date, okay, so that's justification for 410. Things changed between about 390 and 420 in the direction of the growing sense that the empire is now a Christian empire for real. That may be a little early, but what about the opening date? Well, that may seem a little bit less obvious. 249/250 marks what is generally considered the first empire-wide persecution of Christians in the reign of the emperor Decius, who reigned from 249 to 251. Now, Decius's decree, and we're talking about this over here, Decius's decree differed in important ways from earlier local episodes of persecution. Previously, following a protocol laid out by the Emperor Trajan as early as the year 110, people accused of Christianity, which was a crime, would be called before a magistrate and compelled to sacrifice or offer a libation, and maybe to curse Christ. If they did so, they were dismissed, no questions asked. But if not, they would be handed over to the provincial authorities who, if the criminals persisted, would have them executed, or if they were rich, relegated, which is to say exiled with their property confiscated. By contrast, Decius appears to have decreed that all inhabitants of the empire, or all family units living in the empire, must offer sacrifices to the gods, not specifying which gods, and possibly must swear that they had always done so. Whoever fulfilled this requirement was issued a receipt of actual, papyrus or whatever, potsherd, indicating that he had fulfilled, that he or she or they had fulfilled their obligation to offer a sacrifice. A rather large number of such receipts survive from Egypt. Decius could not have been unaware that Christians were not permitted to sacrifice to the gods, but his decree lacked the features of later, more focused persecutions. No destruction of Christian books, no razing of churches, no confiscation of funds, just the requirement of a sacrifice, a requirement applied not just to suspected Christians, but to every individual, or at least every family in the empire. James Reeves, and I'm talking about this person down here, a historian of Roman religion, has argued, in my view, convincingly, that this episode was a landmark in the bureaucratization of traditional religion and its transformation from exclusively local and decentralized into something like taxation, of essential concern to the emperor, but also, like taxation, but unlike traditional cults, obligatory for every individual or family unit. It tells us a lot about traditional imperial religion that the decree has no ideational content, that the divine beneficiaries of the sacrifice were left to be decided by local authorities. They didn't need to be Roman gods specifically, or the emperor, and that what mattered above all was the ritual act, sacrifice. Surely the purpose was to ensure the pax deorum, that is the goodwill of the gods, empire-wide, and also to define a class of those who rejected the patriotic project of winning divine favor through use of sacrifice, which was the most basic common language of ancient religion. Decius thus anticipates Constantine by no coincidence. Decius's decree was, as Christian writers at the time claimed, a persecution, and a serious one. But it was also part of the process of state creation, which had been proceeding by fits and starts since the first century. And its nearest analog and immediate predecessor was the Constitutio Antoniniana of 212, which I mentioned earlier. I think last week it probably came up. This is the decree of the Emperor Caracalla that all free citizens, all free subjects of the Roman Empire are henceforth to be regarded as citizens. In other words, we're moving away from a conqueror and subject model of empire to something more like an imperial state. And the introduction of religion into the mix, and that's what it is, by the Emperor Decius is another step in that process. In this view, it was also a landmark in the process of religious change, which led quite directly to Christianization just 2 generations later. But this process was of tremendous importance for the Jews, and I'd like to illustrate this with one of the late antique texts that I've mentioned, the Martyrdom of Pioneers, this text over here, written in the late 3rd or 4th century, concerning a bishop of Smyrna martyred under Decius. This text contains an interesting and surprising discussion of the Jews. By way of introduction to the issue, we have to ask whether the Jews too were victims of the Decian persecution, and if not, how they avoided the obligation to offer sacrifices, as strongly prohibited for Jews as it was for Christians. Some scholars have suggested that Jews were simply exempted a priori. This is a theoretical possibility, I think. Jews could have pointed to the fact that they paid their tax to the special tax to the fiscus judaicus, the Jewish fisc, and said, well, this gives us a right to practice Jewish law, and Jewish law means we can't offer sacrifices. So here, here is the receipt that's necessary. This tax receipt should prove our case. Now, that's actually possible, but it doesn't exclude the possibility that not every Roman magistrate or municipal magistrate is going to accept that argument. I think that inescapably, the issue was adjudicated locally, meaning that the Jews essentially had to plead for exemption if they wished to be exempted. The Palestinian Talmud, is my one and only reference to rabbinic literature in these 3 lectures, would claim that during a later persecution, the Samaritans had offered the required libations, whereas the Jews had not, suggesting that the abstention took some initiative or courage or action on the Jews' part. This strongly suggests that, according to this source, exemptions were not given automatically. The object was to root out Christians, but in the Talmudic case, Samaritans felt that they had to go along despite not being Christian. Jews had apparently, in the Talmud story, figured out a way to protect themselves. In 249, Jews could have argued that if the goal was restoring the Pax Deorum, the goodwill of the gods, that is the goodwill of the traditional imperial gods, including local gods all over the empire, not excluding arguably the God of Israel, then the Jews, who themselves still constituted a certain kind of civitas, a certain kind of polity, or nation of some sort, have their own ancestral way of worshiping their God, which once involved sacrifice, as a matter of fact, but now, thanks to the Romans, no longer did. Some magistrates might have been convinced by this argument, especially if it came wrapped in a bribe, and others might have accepted the bribe without worrying about the argument too much. In other places, Jews might have acted as many Christians did, either tried to hide or cross their fingers, as it were, and hoped and offered the sacrifice. Well, in other words, we're kind of speculating about the response of the Jews. It wasn't meant as a persecution of the Jews, but it was also intended as a way to test the fealty of Romans to the traditional religions of the Roman Empire. And the Jews might have actually, in some cases, fallen foul of that. Let's take a closer look at Pioneers now. Pioneers' main intertext is the better known Martyrdom of Polycarp. That's this text up here, whose dramatic date is in the middle of the 2nd century, though the text was probably written considerably later. One of the most striking differences between Polycarp and Pioneers is that Pioneers' account of the socio-political and religious situation at Smyrna is much more circumstantial, detailed, and lifelike than that of the highly schematic Polycarp. Polycarp, in the manner of the New Testament book of Acts, imagines Jews and Greeks in conspiracy against the Christians. Indeed, Polycarp's Jews and Greeks, unlike those of Acts, are barely distinct from one another except in name. In Polycarp's rather fairy tale-like narrative, Jews and Greeks literally speak in one voice, and they say things appropriate for Greeks, but not really for Jews, like criticizing Christianity for causing the neglect of the traditional gods. Roman officials are alone in showing some sympathy for Christianity, same as in Acts. This schema, of course, ignores the fact that none of these groups was a uniform mass, and anyway, Polycarp's Jews read too much like straw men to allow even a tentative and hypothetical account of the relative position of Jews, Greeks, and Christians at Smyrna. Pioneers, though, captures more complexity. He delineates more clearly the distinctions between Greeks and Jews and is somewhat more concerned about the Jews. He does not imagine Greeks and Jews to be conspiring against the Christians, and the main blame for the violence now falls squarely on Rome, which was pretty much inevitable in the case of the Decian persecution, which is what the Martyrdom of Pioneers is about. Indeed, the non-believing masses are not actually especially hostile to the Christians. How could they be, since many, if not most of the Christians in the wake of the persecution relapsed to paganism, at least temporarily and in public, rather than face martyrdom? Somewhat unexpectedly, though, Paionius warns his flock not to be attracted to the Jews who are welcoming Christians into their communities. Rather, if they choose or already have chosen to reject martyrdom, they should remember that Christ welcomes the penitent. Whom were the Jews inviting, and to do what and when? One scholar has suggested, and this is Walter Ameling, where is he? Yes, right here, Ameling, Christian Lapsi in Smyrna, 250. Ameling may be right to argue that Paionius was addressing the so-called Lapsi, that is, Christians who had reluctantly sacrificed and so renounced Christ, though against their will. Were those being welcomed Lapsi by the Jews, Lapsi of Jewish origin, who arguably would have no need to convert to Judaism, especially if conversion for men was still essentially coextensive with circumcision? Or were Paionius's Lapsi those who were interested in joining the Jewish community, people who felt that connection to Judaism with or without conversion, while not fully satisfying, might still be better than nothing? One might at least avoid further idolatry and idolatrous sacrifice and continue to venerate the scriptures. From this possibly historical episode, we also learned something about the Jews of Smyrna, or some of them. They were willing to seek out Christian or formerly Christian converts or sympathizers. Was this true in the absence of persecution too? There's no evidence, but the first major episode of persecution in 249-250 is also the first known case since the Hasmonean period, 400 years earlier, of Jews aggressively seeking adherents. If the Jews' invitation was extended to Lapsi, did the Jews regard their renunciation of Christ, even though forced, to be sufficient? Did they not regard the potential members' indubitable continued covert attachment to Christian doctrines as problematic? Did the ex-Christians in question already decide not to harp on their attachment to Christian doctrine or to maintain it in secret? But Paionius warns precisely against the Jews' attacks on Christian doctrine, which suggests that the Christians were first welcomed but then subjected to theological pressure meant to convince them of the falsity of their former faith. So the Jews' tolerance was contingent and instrumental. In any case, it remains striking that this isolated text is the sole evidence we have for Jews recruiting someone, possibly baptized Jews, but possibly plain Christians, whom they sought perhaps as adherents, but perhaps with the hope that some might eventually convert. Was this a sign of strength and confidence, a desperate attempt to gain support, even from among the modest, the persecuted, the miserable, people on the edge of the law? Was it mere opportunism? The Smyrnaean Jews were acting no differently from various new, unusual, and at least in their early stages, laxist Christian groups, including those in the past designated as Gnostic, who had few scruples about conforming with the state's demands in opening their doors to the failed martyrs of 250. Whatever the answer to these questions may be, the episode may still tell us something about the circumstances under which organized Jewish communities, whatever their eccentricities from our perspective, might begin to emerge. The consolidation of the state around religion, initially traditional municipal cults, demanded a response from the Jews, and a quick one. For the first time since 70, all the Jews of the empire confronted the same challenge, to find a way to respond to the state's temporary embrace of a core religious ritual prohibited to Jews as a defining fixed feature of citizenship. This challenge conceivably sealed the fate of some Jewish groups in the empire, although the decree turned out to be a one-time event, but had a galvanizing impact on others, forcing them to organize, to lobby, to stake a claim in the changing religious landscape, and to recommit to institutional development. And not to sound like a kind of UJA pamphlet, but let's see. Now, I don't want to overstate the impact of the Decian persecution and isolation. It lasted a year and was over. Most bishops welcomed penitent Lapsi back into the church, but it set a precedent. Indubitably, the religious life of the empire changed forever. Another imperial persecution followed 6 years later, more focused on Christians, but still requiring the same sorts of rituals empire-wide, followed by persecutions under Diocletian, who came to the throne in 284, and again in the years immediately preceding Constantine's conversion, ending only in 311. With the elevation of imperial religion to a basic, if not entirely decisive, element of citizenship, whatever arrangements the Jews had developed with their cities and with the state gradually began to come to an end. but the process began long before the Edict of Milan and ended long after it. It took roughly, I would argue, from 250 to 410. So this is a period of change when religion emerges as an important organizing principle in the Roman Empire. First, some version of the traditional religions of the empire, and later various versions of Christianity, with a brief break between 361 and 363, when the Emperor Constantine's relative Julian reverts to paganism, but it's a totally new type of paganism. It's the type of paganism which Decius could only dream about, a pagan church called Hellenism. For the current purposes, the need to use material relatively securely datable to the period between 250 and 410 limits me to discussion of only a few bodies of stuff besides Pioneers. An inscription from the very beginning of the period I alluded to last week, and the assemblages of archaeological material from 2 excavated sites. I expect to be able to expand this body of evidence that were by sort of more careful examination of the larger corpus. Where my argument is headed is that under the pressures just briefly described, specifically Jewish communal institutions began to develop again after 250, but the forms that these institutions took were still very varied, and also in ways that I will explain, peculiarly indigenous, that is not particularly similar to institutions that developed elsewhere in the same period, meaning from the perspective of the Jewish sources, primarily Palestine and the city of Rome. Okay. The 2 sets of archaeological material I have in mind are the famous, shouldn't say famous, some small number of people in the universe, the famous God-Fearer's inscription. You will hear about it very soon. Discovered in Aphrodisias here in inland Caria, and discovered in the 1970s. And the other body of material is associated with Sardis Synagogue, discovered in Sardis in, I think, in the late 50s and early 60s. So we're actually departing from Phrygia, which we've spent so much time in after, but both actually are still close. They're still in the interior of Asia Minor. They're kind of in the larger vicinity of the Meander Valley, though not quite in it. Sardis is in it. Aphrodisias not quite, but it's still quite close to the central cities of Phrygia that we've been talking about. But we're not leaving Phrygia entirely. I want to introduce a little piece of material I alluded to last week, which seems to me pivotal. These include plucked from the mentions of Jewish communal institutions from Hierapolis in Phrygia, again, around here. The material is dated to about the year 250, plus minus a certain number of years, and a larger body of material consisting of 22 inscribed sarcophagi, which, like all other high imperial Asian material, makes no mention of communal officials, uses no Jewish names, and has very little Jewish content at all. But I'd like to note one interesting exception in this body of material, and this is this text over here from Hierapolis. Everything about the text is odd. It's a sarcophagus, inscribed sarcophagus, like all the inscriptions from the necropolis of Hierapolis. Sarcophagus and the place around it belong to Aurelia Augusta, daughter of Zodicus, in which will be buried she herself and her husband Gluconianos, also called Hagnos, which means pure or holy, and their children. If another will be buried there, he will give to the settlement of the Jews settled in Hierapolis. He katokiaton en hierapole katokunton Judaion, a fine of 300 denarii, and to the one who has investigated the matter, 100 denarii. A copy has been deposited in the archive of the Jews. In some ways, a fairly typical text. It's highly legalistic. It's not all that sentimental. It's actually a kind of a legal document. It's meant to be actionable, and that is meant to stand up in court. But it has many peculiarities. The first and most striking peculiarity is the name of what seems to be the Jewish community of Hierapolis. It's, first of all, peculiarly fussy and archaic sounding, and implies that the Jews were not citizens of the city, which is a little bit surprising for the 3rd century, when the Jews were, without apparent exception, including here, Roman citizens. Indeed, the unparalleled name here assigned to the Jewish Association, whatever it is manifestly modeled on the names of well-attested associations of Roman or Italian businessmen in Asian cities, including in Hierapolis itself. All you need to do is replace the word Judaion with Romaion or Italioton, and you have the name of an organization which started out scattered all over Asia in the wake of the Roman annexation of Asia in 133 BCE. Little groups of Roman and Italian businessmen who were often slave traders and various greater or lesser criminals who were trying to make their fortune in Asia Minor by extorting money out of the local residents. And they set up little organizations of mutual aid societies, which were called precisely this: the settlement of the Italian or the Roman businessmen in the name of the city, using the same term katokia, meaning that they were coming from the outside, that they weren't natives and they weren't citizens of the city. They gradually changed into civic clubs, no different than any other civic club. They lost that edge and they lost their association with extractive imperialism, which had been their original reason for coming into existence. And they just continued to exist in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century CE. But they just turned into sort of neutral civic organizations. This is the type of name that they have. We never find this as a name for a Jewish community, but we find it as a name for those types of organizations. A good piece on that is this article by Benedict Eckhart from Journal of Roman Studies 2016, and 2 very good recent dissertations, one by someone called Lisa Aberle from the University of Tübingen, another by my colleague Lakshmi Ramgopal at Columbia. Was there such an organization? Did it really exist in the 3rd century? Was this a real thing? Was Aurelia Augusta remembering an ancient Jewish association that had tried to draw on an association with Romans as a way of enhancing its prestige? We have no way of knowing. This just stands out in isolation. The Jewish archive mentioned at the end likewise comes as a surprise, especially since it's not mentioned in any other Hierapolitan text. The specification of payment to the investigator of the sarcophagus trespass is also unparalleled. Gluconianos's byname, Hagnos, suggests a family especially devoted to piety or purity, and it's perhaps this sort of enhanced kind of ill-defined religiosity combined with a kind of, whatever this organization is, a kind of, I want to use the little word tribalism, dedication to archaic, specifically Hellenistic Greek forms of expression of communal identity, a fussiness about the integrity of burial, extreme even for Roman Asia, where such fussiness was the rule for all those who could afford a proper burial. Maybe this is a small part of what Asian Jewish piety entailed before late antiquity. Here then may be an example of the indigeneity that I spoke about earlier, as well as the beginnings of the formation of an actual communal organization of some sort, but of a very strange type that we don't really find anyplace else. Now, no item, we're moving on to Sardis and Aphrodisias, no item more than the Sardis Synagogue generated the view that Asian Jewry was a model Jewry of the Roman diaspora that had figured out the magic formula for prosperous survival, aided and abetted by a Roman state whose attitude to the Jews turned out to have been surprisingly benign. This was based on not implausible extrapolation from certain obvious facts. For example, pages stuck together. For example, the Sardis Synagogue was massive. Here in this slide, you can see that it's part of this large, this is a very large square. And it's a complex of buildings, which in the High Roman Empire housed the gymnasium, which is not your local equinox. This is an important civic institution in any Greek city, and the bathhouse right next to it. And some other rooms, whatever they may be. Now here, down at the very bottom, is the synagogue. It shares a roof with a palaestra, with the main chamber of the gymnasium. This is massively long. Here's the narthex, here's the nave of the synagogue, the entry area, and the main area of the synagogue. It's 50 meters long, just the nave, and it's said to have provided space for about 1,000 worshipers. It's situated apparently in right smack in one of the city's main civic complexes. The synagogue was heavily decorated. Actually, that's the picture that was used on the flyer for this talk, and that's actually the best picture of the specific synagogue site that I could find. So it's heavily decorated. The decoration, is demonstrated by many dedicatory inscriptions commemorating the funding of the massive mosaic pavement, although it's entirely geometric. It's a geometric carpet mosaic. There's no figuration on the mosaic pavement at all. And there's also decoration on the walls, which are also commemorated in inscriptions using opus sectile, that is cut up stones, sawed stone inlaid into the walls. Called skutlos, it's in Greek. Comparably to the deceased of Hierapolis in Akmonea, okay, there we are. In the 3rd century, the benefactors of the Sardis Synagogue advertise their Roman connections. They're careful about using Roman nomenclature whenever they have it, whenever it's possible. Their Sardis citizenship, here you can see in several of the inscriptions, it's just a small selection. There are many, many more. And where relevant, their membership in the Boule and the city council of Sardis. Some of them also designated themselves as God-fearers or as proselytes. And again, you can see examples just in this selection here. I should emphasize that those designations, God-fearers and proselytes, are nearly absent in high imperial texts from Asia Minor. They are almost impossible to find. You can find them a little bit. There are only a few inscriptions from earlier, but they do appear a little bit earlier from the pre-70 period. And now you can find them again, starting in this period that I'm talking about now. In sum, Sardis provides evidence for a prosperous Jewish community, or with prosperous elements in it, retaining powerful loyalties internally and drawing plenty of support from the outside, on the model of Act's Asian communities of an earlier era. Apparently, proudly displaying the fact that they're Jewish, Roman, and Sardian. At the same time, this community made no use of Hebrew. There are some Hebrew texts from the synagogue, but they're from later periods of utilization of the synagogue, 5th, 6th century probably, and had little obvious connection with the Judaism of the rabbinic group, which was on the rise in Palestine during the High and later empire. So a phenomenon that was simultaneously strange in its environment and completely local. The view that the discovery of the Sardis synagogue must change forever our understanding both of Asian Jewry under Roman rule and, more tenuously, but still, the Roman Jewish diasporic experience in general, was tirelessly promoted by the archaeologist and theologian A.T. Krabel. I'm not going to say much about him here, although he had a tremendous influence on what I've been talking about for the last few weeks. Though elements of Krabel's approach have stuck, there has been much revision as well. One issue is date. When Krabel wrote in the 1960s, the tendency was to date the earlier phases of the Sardis synagogue, including most of these inscriptions, to the earlier 3rd century. But excavation under the pavement of the nave made it clear that the main construction had actually started a century later, in the mid-4th century at earliest. More recently, the archaeologist Jody Magnus has argued for a 6th century foundation date for the synagogue. But I have to tell you that just from the perspective of the epigraphy, and I know more about that than I do about archaeology and about how to date things stratigraphically, but one can easily see that these are not 6th century texts. They just have none of the earmarks. A 6th century text is a distinctive thing, and these are not them. So just from the epigraphical perspective, it's a very unlikely date. Archaeologists have also cast severe doubts on the stratigraphic argument, so I'm sticking with the 4th century date. How long the synagogue remained in use is unclear. Recent investigation has also demonstrated just how reliant the construction was on spolia, that is, on items which were originally used for a different purpose, and then reused in the context of the synagogue, probably including this famous assemblage. This table, which is decorated with high relief eagles, is actually over here, not head on, and also these carvings of stone lions, which are things that are are a little bit unusual to find in synagogues. The relief, not so much, but the actual statues are a little bit strange. You don't find anything like that in Palestine in particular, or even in archaeological synagogues in the diaspora. So this is a fairly unusual assemblage of material. Again, it wasn't made for this synagogue. It was made for some other purpose. This is older than the synagogue. Others have noted that by the mid-4th century, the gymnasial complex was no longer in use. So the larger building complex was no longer a central civic location, but may have been partly abandoned. In other words, the idea that the location of the synagogue demonstrates the Jews' imbrication in this structure of civic society of Sardis is actually something which is ripe for revision. It's actually not quite true. Martin Goodman found the general disposition of this place so peculiar that he speculated that it was not a conventional Jewish synagogue at all, but a sanctuary for God-fearers. Hence their prominence in the synagogue's epigraphy, either God-fearers or those people, Gentiles, whatever they were originally, who have some connection to the Jewish community. Whatever, I'm leaving it unspecific. While it is true that it is an odd synagogue, no other God-fearer synagogues have ever been identified, so there's nothing to compare it to. So the hypothesis is a little speculative, and it may not be entirely necessary. A few words about Aphrodisias, the other main location. This is approximately a 7-foot tall. There was a full view. You would see it was shaped like an obelisk, although the very top is broken, which was unearthed in the 1970s. And it received a full publication in 1987 with an extensive commentary. The epigraphical element of the publication is actually completely impeccable, although it's interesting that the authors didn't try to translate the text, which is quite illuminating. The historical commentary is a different story. Reynolds' co-author, Robert Tannenbaum, made the assumption that normative Judaism was rabbinic Judaism, and so he interpreted the entire item in light of rabbinic sources, which was an idea which was out of date by 1987. People were no longer making that assumption. This, in interaction with the editor's decision to date the two separate texts, because there are two separate texts here, at the earliest end of the spectrum of paleographical possibility, minimizing the many inconveniences which would have been more obvious to someone more versed in the specifically Jewish branch of epigraphy, led some in the field wildly astray for a few years. In other words, the letter forms of the text could be anywhere, according to Reynolds herself, from the late 2nd century CE to the early 5th century CE. There was no way to tell just on the basis of the letter forms or the spelling or anything like that. But they opted for the earlier end of the spectrum, dating it to around 200 rather than around 400. But in order to do this, they were overlooking things that, to people who sort of specialize in Jewish epigraphy, really inexplicable at the earlier date. Like the use of biblical names, and biblical names which aren't transcribed into Greek. They're simply, Benjamin is just Benjamin. He's not given a typical Greek suffix, Benjaminos or something like that. Yosef is Yosef, not Yosepos, and so on and so forth. So those are things which are specifically late antique. You almost never find them. Certainly you don't find them in Asia before sometime in the later sometime in the 4th century. So the dating to around 200 seemed to be a miscalculation. In 2002, Angelos Chaniotis published a definitive reconsideration of the text, first insisting that there were actually two of them, and that what Reynolds called side B, this one, was actually the earlier of the two, and side A was the later one, and that the date of the earlier text is probably mid to late 4th century, and the date of the later one is probably around 400, the beginning of the 5th century. This is now the consensus in the field, despite a few holdouts, and completely alters the way we understand this text and its importance. Much in this inscription resonates with what we find at Sardis, the prominence in the text of God-fearers, and to a lesser extent proselytes, the prominence likewise of city council members down here, the emergence of an onomastic practice, sharply distinct from that attested among Asian Jews earlier. Indeed, this is just a specific aspect of a larger shift in Asian naming practice between the High and Late Empire, which has made it impossible to trace family continuities between the periods. One part, though, seems quite different. Though unusual in several respects, the Sardis Synagogue is most indubitably a synagogue, whoever was using it, whereas the organizations whose members or subscribers are listed in the Aphrodisian obelisk is of obscure nature and function. Now, here, if there was an organization, we don't know what it was. The top is broken. Here, however, we have the beginning of the inscription, and it names an organization, and it's a very peculiar thing, very difficult to make any sense of. First of all, it starts out, this is a blessing at the beginning. It's like, what pious Jews do today, and they put God's, a little invocation of God's name at the top of a sheet. Here, God is described as a helper of the snack bar owners, the cook shop owners. That's the most likely translation, and it's very strange, but it may be another case of a sort of a trade organization playing an important kind of quasi-communal role. Except then we have this other thing: the undersigned members of the Decany of the Lovers of Learning, also called those who are constantly uttering blessing, founded this memorial for the consolation of grief for the masses from their own resources. Now, Decania is a strange word. In Christian epigraphy, it refers to a burial society, and that's actually the most likely translation here. But the language here, it's pious language, but it's not pious language which resonates with very much else. It's its own thing. Let's see, what else can we say about this? Okay, so this list lists God-fearers, proselytes, one priest, so others who are presumably plain Jews. The proselytes and plain Jews disproportionately have biblical names, whereas the God-fearers don't. I'm talking now about this text A, the later text. The one member may be called the Palatinos, Theodotus the Palatinos, which is an official. Others do not have professional designations on this side, unlike those listed on face B, except for there's a psalm singer, which is either a communal office or a professional designation. On the other face, though, the earlier and longer text, first of all, the first peculiarity is that Jews and God-fearers are listed separately. Here are the Jews, here are the God-fearers. No proselytes appear in this text. Many of the Jews, again, have biblical names, though not, and none of the God-fearers do. Several of the God-fearers, but none of the Jews, are city councilors. There are 9 city councilors in the list of God-fearers. And even at this state, being a city councilor probably implies large-scale land ownership. This side of the text lists occupations, which is of great interest. And it introduces us to a community which seems, aside from the city councilors, to consist almost entirely of craftsmen and small merchants. And you can see yourself, we're talking about a greengrocer, actually a shepherd, which is very strange and interesting. There's a shopkeeper, a pastry chef, or pâtissier, a bird seller, a seller of used clothes, which has a kind of medieval or early modern sound to it for a Jew, but probably unconnected. The God-fearers, 9 of them are city councilors, but then the non-city councilors also have a range of occupations, which are a little bit different from those of the Jews: sausage makers, athletes, fullers, that is, people who launder and whiten clothing, wool clothing. Some of the merchants, well, what's striking and what appears another consistent feature in our sources is how identified Jews, but not only Jews according to this, were in these settings with handicrafts and shopkeeping. Confirming the latter at Aphrodisias is the fact that several shops in the Sebasteon complex, formerly a center of the imperial cult, but transformed in late antiquity into an indoor market, are marked with graffiti of minaret. The dedicatory inscriptions from the Sardis Synagogue do not list occupations, with a handful of exceptions, but the number of city councilors is very striking. The donors at Sardis on the whole come across as a more aristocratic group than the donors or subscribers at Aphrodisias, even though small sections, well, okay. So, okay, I didn't actually mean to do that, but we're not quite there yet. One brief one last bit from the Sardis Synagogue before I conclude. The items I surveyed attest to an emerging Jewish religious institutional culture. Whatever one makes of the site of the Sardis Synagogue, it still took considerable communal expenditure to purchase, remodel, decorate, and maintain. And at Sardis, we likewise see a case of the Judaization, or rather de-Hellenization of the specific linguistic practices of euergetism, of the sort of public donation characteristic of the life of Greek cities and under Rome. Here, the donors, rather than taking pride in giving money from their own funds, refer to giving money from the gifts of providence or from the gifts of the Almighty God. In other words, they're playing with that language of donation, with the municipal language of donation, and they're making it, well, Jewish and religious. This corresponds with a growing tendency to perform piety in public texts, easily legible too at aphrodisias, but not visible anywhere in the Asian Jewish epigraphical record previously, at least not with respect to Jewish piety. This is reflected too in the shifts in naming practices, which in the course of the 4th century was becoming also strongly Judaized, biblicized. At the same time, things still look quite different than they would later. The Sardis Synagogue possessed something which was probably an ark for Torah scrolls. And there was someone involved in the community who was called a priest and a teacher of wisdom. But the community remained open apparently to pagans or to Christians and used figurative items which cannot simply be explained away as spolia. They were put into reuse for some reason, which we cannot reconstruct. Similarly, the aphrodisiacs inscriptions are full of pious language, but it is language that does not resonate with anything else, a peculiar local Jewish piety after all. And despite what is often written, there isn't any actual evidence so far at aphrodisiacs for a synagogue. The title of the earlier list of Jews and God-fearers is missing, but the later text uses hard-to-parse language, apparently to describe the activities of a burial society, as I said before. I need to do more work to try to figure out who the God-fearers in these inscriptions might have been. Scholars have tacitly assumed that they must have been pagans because the penalties applying to Christians who affiliate partly with Jewish communities would be expected to be very severe. But I would guess that this was less true in the 4th century than in the mid-5th and following, and that there were cities where the Christians and or pagans in question might have had enough clout to evade prosecution. Peter Brown wrote quite a lot about the lability of religious identity, that people sort of switch religious identities in the 4th century, referring mainly to the upper reaches of the aristocracy. But these texts and materials from places like Aphrodisias and Sardis may actually show it for segments of local populations a few rungs down the social ladder. Just to conclude, I'm going to end the share. And so to conclude, let me try to draw some things together. Let me begin by stating the obvious. I have not discovered a trick that will make it possible to write political history from stones. I would like to think that even though I've made a case that I've made a case that strong hypotheses, and strong as I hope, I'm going out on a limb, can be constructed through cautiously skeptical juxtaposition and the mutual fructification of induction and deduction. Sometimes we can speculate guardedly but plausibly about the politics behind the stones. We may be able to do something similar with the social history behind the stones too, but here issues are slightly different. Stones are often used to provide direct access to social history, and so ancient historians have actually often been too positivistic. They often forget that inscriptions, obviously, as well as iconography and architecture and design, have their own poetics, which in itself is an important historical datum, but which means that these things cannot simply be mined as if they were raw data. Just like text, they need to be interpreted, albeit with different tools. I was able, I think, to suggest one concrete example of something like this last week when I inferred somewhat speculatively that the standard tropes of the high imperial dedicatory inscription, this is from the Synagogue of Severa at Achamonea, and the formulaic language of communal organization was likely to be concealing a set of relationships between upper-class Greek masters or patrons and Jewish slaves and freedmen. But I would also argue that this exercise is possible, even if in the end it only amounts to the generation of hypotheses, only because the context is relatively well understood. If it were really true that all we knew about the Jews of Asia in the Roman period was the repertoire of material collected from the corpora and excavation reports, then I would say that we would be largely in the dark. I set out to challenge the view that the Jews in Asia as a group attained over the long term an enviable balance between integration and separation, a status that allowed them to be substantively and continually Jewish while maintaining a strong and generally well-accepted presence in the lives of their cities. A strong form of this argument would be that Jewish communities or synagogues formed part of the quasi-authorized fabric of municipal life, which was precisely Krabel's argument for Sardis, and by extension for Asia in general. This was to start with a problematic hypothesis, reliant, as I noted 2 weeks ago, on the trick of aggregating evidence that was widely scattered geographically and chronologically, ignoring some bits and interpreting the rest as maximalistically and optimistically as possible. But this is self-evidently unacceptable on basic methodological grounds. The material must be separated by time and place and interpreted as cautiously and minimalistically as possible, all while we generate hypotheses about it based not only on internalist analysis of the text and remains, but on what we know about the variety of contexts in which the evidence is situated. In my view, this is more or less first-year grad school stuff, but amazingly few ancient historians work this way, even though arguably the fields of both ancient and Jewish history have been repeatedly revolutionized by outbreaks of methodological and theoretical awareness, which somehow never quite catch. Such an approach obviously yields a very different picture. First of all, geography turns out to be important. I think that I can state that there was a palpable difference between Old Greek Asia Minor and New Greek Asia Minor, the former consisting of the west and southwestern coast of Asia, including cities like Ephesus and Smyrna, Miletus, Tralles, Halicarnassus, and the latter of cities of the interior, still in Western Asia Minor, not in Eastern Asia Minor, where there's no evidence, including the Galatian and Lycian cities mentioned in Acts of the Apostles, like Iconium, Antioch of Pisidia, Lystra, and places that I've discussed also, like Hierapolis, Sardis, Aphrodisias, and so on. Some of the older cities, Ephesus and Smyrna, were very large, but there's some evidence that the Greeks in those places came to embrace, at least for a time in the High Roman Empire, the extreme politicized Hellenism, well attested also in Alexandria and in Antioch in Syria, which was quite antipathetic to Jews. On the other hand, in newer cities, where the main political currency was loyalty to Rome, Jews might in some periods find provisional acceptance more readily. But in all cases, it seems likely that Jewish life in Asia suffered a blow in the wake of the Jewish revolts, which affected all Jews in the empire. The material that we examine shows Jewish institutions under considerable strain, alternatively Jews, even while remaining Jewish, avoiding organization, perhaps in some cases entirely. Indeed, there remains Jewish self-identification in the sources, but it was well compartmentalized. It seems obvious that high imperial conditions, with the Jews reduced to indemnity payment and the ideology of the empire riding high, produced impacts which varied widely from place to place. But Jews on the whole were probably not involved in municipal politics and avoided the euergetistic, the economy of donation and honor, pointing to profound limitations on their integration, just as they strove to emphasize their Romanness. Indeed, perhaps this suggests a trace of the survival of the old dynamic, Jews aspiring to imperial support in cities whose goodwill could not be taken for granted. Another striking absence in this period is evidence for proselytes or God-fearers. The solution to the Jews' systemic integrative problems in the cities, not present. They didn't pursue it, or at least not energetically enough to leave traces in the evidence. And remember that conversion to Judaism was actually illegal. If there was a period when the common picture has a chance of being partly applicable, it is in what I've been calling the long 4th century, when the redefinition of the state along religious lines may have had a galvanizing impact on some Asian Jews. In this period, Jewish institutions, if not necessarily synagogues, once again emerge. And now, for the first time, we witness the rather confounding abundance of both proselytes and God-fearers, the latter of whom, at both Sardis and Aphrodisias, sometimes seem wealthy and well-connected in the city government, which, however, and in both places, though more clearly in Aphrodisias, the God-fearers support Jewish communities whose members are socioeconomically, on the whole, very modest. This may alert us to the possibility that, as in the case of early imperial Achaemenea, something else is lurking behind the religious language. But late antique changes in Roman nomenclature make it harder than it had been earlier to read social ties from names. We can identify really very easily who is whose libertus, freedman or freedwoman, because traditional Roman names, family names have passed into desuetude. That was the way we could often tell previously. Was the Roman Empire good for the Jews? Last paragraph. In sum, I would not be inclined simply to reverse the rosy picture advocated by the advocates of Roman Jewish-Greek convivencia, but rather to emphasize that there is no simple answer to the question of whether the Roman Empire was good for the Jews, with one proviso. The Romans created their imperial state through acts of profound violence and disruption, and maintained it, despite the small size of the Roman army and administration before the Diocletianic reforms, by a regime that combined terror-inducing threat and rewards for those who yielded to them. As for Jews, they were crushed repeatedly and violently, their polity destroyed, and to the extent that their unusual religion depended on Jerusalem, the Jerusalem temple, it too was destroyed. Before that point, though, the state regarded the Jews as an allied nation. This recognition was in profound tension from the start with another principle. Roman rule in the East depended heavily on the state's alliance with Greek municipal leadership. Where the state could yield privileges to the Jews without harming its more politically important alliance, it did so. Where it could not, the results were catastrophic. The crushing of Jewish uprisings in the Greek world in 70, which broke out in sympathy with the Jewish rebellion in Judea, and again in 116 with immense savagery. But there followed a long period when the Jews, repeatedly crushed, their political standing in the eyes of the state reduced, had largely lost the competition with Greek municipalities. What happened then? At this point, I think local variation kicks in earnest. Until the late 4th century, the Jews apparently could not organize and lobby translocally and enjoyed no institutional intermediation with the state as a group. The evidence for the impact of this condition on the affairs from Asia is very mixed. Most communities probably do not last long, though there are important exceptions. I would emphasize that this in itself does not, but at most sites, the evidence is for Jewish presence is not distributed over long periods. One could suggest hesitantly that between 70 and about 250, Jewish institutional life was weak and heavily compromised, but in most places anyway, Jews did not participate in the city's culture of display and benefaction. Later, under pressures produced by the emerging role of religion in unifying a Roman state starting in 250, Jewish institutions reemerge, and with them in a surprisingly prominent way in Asia, the role of Gentile intermediaries, patrons and friends, at least in some places. In some cities, Jews seem to have been of modest social standing, and the God-fearers may have served in patronal roles, even aside from their hypothetical role as intermediaries between the communities and the cities. In others, like Sardis, there were wealthy Jews too, but God-fearers may still have needed to play some intercessory role, perhaps showing that even in durable and established Jewish communities, Jews remained under certain pressures in the municipalities, and the state was no longer involved in intervention. The counterexample are a handful of laws in Book 16 of the Theodosian Code, mostly dating to the 390s, a very particular moment when, by no coincidence, a revived Jewish dynastic leadership in Palestine had the ear of the Theodosian emperors. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seth. That was a brilliant and stirring conclusion to the lecture and to the series. There's time now for some questions from the audience. And while the audience is gathering itself, let me pick up on the very last sentence of your talk and the reintroduction of the Palestinian Jewish community. Mm-hmm. And what looking back at what developed in Palestine, does that, and both before your ending point and then subsequently as you sort of look into the future, how isolated does either the Western Asian model that you're talking about appear, or the Palestinian model? In other words, can we look from one to the other?
Well, they're not. I mean, there are certainly parallel developments. I mean, I have to say that they're a little bit more visible later. That is, once you get deeper into the 5th century and beyond, that they start becoming a little bit more palpable. Where, inscriptions site I mentioned, but I haven't spoken about it all, from, let's say, Korikos in Cilicia, which is a 6th century site. It's like Hierapolis. There's a big necropolis with lots of sarcophagi, and you have these, a handful of the inscriptions are people who are manifestly Jewish, but now their Jewishness is overdetermined. They're called Jews. They have Menorot on the things, and other Jewish symbols, and sometimes even a little shalom at the end, and that kind of thing. There's no way on the face of it of telling where those, if you just had the inscriptions. Now, burial above ground in sarcophagi is something which happens in Asia a lot. It doesn't happen in Palestine. So, the archaeological context makes it clear where you are. But if you just had the text, those texts could come from anywhere. They could come from Palestine. They could come from Egypt, because Jews come back to Egypt. They could come from Syria. They could come from, even to some extent, southern Italy, from that period. So then, we're definitely talking about, things are spreading, things are disseminating. I see that a little bit less in the earlier period. It is in the period, let's say, ending about 400, let's say. I don't see that so much. There's less evidence for it. Even though, there are literary sources which tell us about patriarchs, the Tiberian patriarchs, that is that Palestinian dynasty that I mentioned at the very, very end, sending emissaries out specifically to Asia Minor to drum up business. But that's, probably the beginning of a process which bears fruit later. And its impact isn't so visible in our period. Or maybe it would be, tomorrow an excavation will dig up something which makes it clearer. But in the meantime, the Asian Jews are still doing their Asian Jewish stuff. There are also certain things which happen they're probably happening in Greek cities in Palestine also. The idea of Jews having a separate place in the theater, or of Jews supporting a particular circus faction, the Blues. That's something which you can certainly find it in Caesarea, possibly in Tiberias. And you can also find it in Antioch in Syria, and you can find it in Ephesus, and in other places as well. That's partly a result of just the ambience of the very late empire, beginning of the Byzantine period. Every city had, but that these are everywhere. The sort of dedication to the theater, and also to the chariot races is that the Jews are like everyone else in the city, and especially the sort of people of the lower classes, which I guess probably the Jews actually were for the most part. But still, so those aren't specifically Asian things, but those are things that you can find anywhere, but they aren't disseminating from any central source. They're simply, a shared set of responses to a set of shared conditions.
Does this difference that you're pointing to, the sort of 5th century and beyond, in these various different types of common empire-wide Jewish manifestations, does this suggest to you a kind of internally, sort of in Jewish terms, way of seeing a threshold between antiquity and some new period after?
What do you mean?
Well, the common manifestations, Jews in Italy or Egypt, Palestine, Asia, that you're talking about in this later period, as opposed to the earlier period, suggests a way to go back to the beginning of this lecture, periodization via practice.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the period that starts from where you're pointing to then continues for hundreds of more years.
Yeah. I think it kind of does, because actually, the discontinuity of 410 is a weak it's a weak cleavage point. That's probably the wrong term, but it's not a profound cleavage point. It's a little bit artificial. It's more like a moment chosen in a longer process of gradual change. And the real nub of the change, I think, in the end, has to go back to imperial policy. And, and I think what's new for me about what I was saying tonight is that I'm bringing it back, fairly deep into the high empire. I'm not starting it with Christianity, because actually the emergence of, sorry to use the loaded term, but religion, of religious practice as something which starts to be, the centralization of religious practice, which is implicit in the empire-wide persecutions, which begin in 250, is actually all of a piece. It's all, once again, and not once again, but actually really for the first time, religion is of interest to the state. That is how people deal with the gods, not how they think about the gods. They never really cared about how people thought about the gods. That's why you could go on being a pagan. You could be a polytheist into the 7th century if you wanted to be. What it meant in the 7th century is unclear. I guess you could still think of yourself. You could go on adoring the gods and probably going to church every Sunday, but still, be devoted to the gods, be a Hellenist, as they called it. That's what the word was. So they didn't care about, even Christians didn't care that much, provided you weren't a Christian. Provided you weren't a Christian, they didn't care what you believed. If you were a Christian, then they cared a lot what you believed. But they did care what you did. And, so it was important. There's this flood of legislation initially controlling and then outlawing sacrifice altogether. It's just part of the same continuum that begins with Decius. The terms have changed a little bit, but it's the same organizing impulse that everyone now has to do this stuff. Everyone has, everyone, you don't have to be Christian, but you have to not do animal sacrifice. That's the least we ask, we ask of you the least, not to do animal sacrifice. Shut down the temples, and various other things. So the idea that the state is legislating issues of like religious practice and religious status, that it's of interest to the state, as part of what it means to be Roman, is something which, as I said, it begins before Constantine, and it's something that is continuous. It just keeps on going. And it's slightly different. The terms change a little bit, mainly if you're a heretic. The definition of heresy changes constantly, obviously. It's well known. So in that sense, it is all a single continuous period. And the idea of putting a break at around 400 or 410 is just that until that point, there's a sense in which the state itself is strongly continuous with what came before. The Roman aristocracy is not Christian to a very large extent until the 370s, 380s, 390s. Constantinople is a different story, but that just starts really in 395. So the operative aristocracy for most of the period that I'm talking about is still the Roman aristocracy. They're not Christian. There's still a lot of emperors who die are still divi. They're still divine. And then that changes when it becomes clear that the empire now is really, no one could count who was living in the Roman Empire, but was really Christian. That is, more and more people were Christian. You could sense there were cities which were Christian. Antioch was heavily Christian. It was a very Christian city. Constantinople was supposedly a Christian city. So yes, they're the continuous, but it's really, I still see the role of the state as being very important in deciding what's happening and determining in a way what's happening. But I think I have a more complex view of the impact on the local level. That is, it's, the larger changes are still dictated by the state, but how that works out from city to city is still, it's very varied and very unpredictable.
Thank you. I have a question from Glenn Thompson in the audience. Do we have any Jewish libelli from the Decian period? If observant, in quotes, Jews were able to worship their God as part of the Pax Deorum, would that have been recognized with the signed libellus?
Well, that would be great. That would be, in fact, it would be so great that it would almost definitely be forged. It would just be too good to be true. But no, no, unfortunately, there are none. And I think one of the issues is that they come from Egypt, and in 250 there were still not very many Jews living in Egypt. If we had Levy from Syria or Palestine or Asia, the story might be different, but we don't. If we did, I would have saved myself a lot of trouble. But we don't have anything like that. We don't have those texts which indicate that people have fulfilled their obligation by doing what they needed to do, or they had some legitimate excuse.
Okay. Another question, you mentioned the Peter Brown idea of lability in religious identity. How far do you think that can work for Jews?
Probably not that far, in all honesty. Although, having said that, I don't know. The thing is that I said it's sort of not actually tongue in cheek, but because the texts are actually that we have, they're very insistent on maintaining the categories. Yes, they're all supporting the synagogue. They're all supporting the same communal institutions and everything like that. But they seem to be insisting on keeping the categories separate. So they're just the plain Jews, who I believe, who don't seem to have special titles attached to them. But then the proselytes and the God-fearers are very careful to be identified, to identify themselves as proselytes and God-fearers. And the earlier Aphrodisian texts actually make separate lists for proselytes and for apparently plain Jews and God-fearers. So, in that sense, well, lability may not be quite the right word. And Peter Brown had something a little bit different in mind, and he was thinking again about, high aristocrats who actually might turn up in one source as a Christian and another source as not a Christian. And, they weren't, the argument being that people like that weren't really too worked up about those definition problems. Whereas in our little bourgeois environment that we're talking about, people were very worked up about the definitions. But they're all sitting there together. And that's an interesting thing. We don't really know what the God-fearers are. It's interesting that they're onomastically distinct from the Jews. They don't give their children special names. Their children just have the sort of standard 4th century names, which are different from earlier names, but they don't have specifically, marked names in any way, whereas by this time the Jews do. And apparently, assuming proselytes means what we think it means, proselytes are also adopting Jewish names or giving their children Jewish names, biblical, those sort of indeclinable names, biblical names in Greek, where they're, it's like living in America and giving your kid a Hebrew name, just like not an anglicized Hebrew name, but just a Hebrew name. That's the equivalent of what many people were doing then. And God-fearers didn't do it. Proselytes and Jews did do it. So they're not, is there movement between those categories? Maybe, I don't know. No, I just really touched on the question of who the God-fearers might have been. Everyone always thinks, well, they must be pagans, because how could a Christian do that? It's heresy. How could it not be heretical to do that? But that doesn't mean they didn't do it, just because you're not supposed to. So, we don't know who they were. And it could be that this is an issue which can be examined a little bit more closely.
Well, I think on that note of the issues that can be examined more closely, we'll bring tonight and the series to a close. And just to conclude, that I think one of the things you've provided us with, for you, it may be the lower level methodology for beginning graduate students, but I think for the rest of us, it's been a wonderful masterclass in slaloming through a whole slew of challenges, of half facts, of obscurities, of pinpricks of data amidst a sea of oblivion. And it's really with a great debt of gratitude to you for guiding us with such a sure hand that I bid you farewell and thank our audience for joining us here for this lecture and these lectures. And we will keep you posted about the resumption of this series in the near future.
Okay.
Seth, thank you very
Well,
much.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks to everyone out there. So goodbye.